Welcome to the Built with Grace podcast, and thanks for joining us on our study, God Shows Up, a study on God's timing. God's timing is always perfect, but not always comfortable. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review and share this with your friends. This helps us get the word out to more people. Also, leave your email address if you would like information on upcoming study guides. Chapter 11 God Shows Up When I Need to Take a Strong Stand. God sighting. God shows up when we are willing to risk everything for our relationship with Him. Most students would be excited to take a class in which the professor was also the author of the textbook. Imagine sitting under the tutelage of someone who could be an expert in the topic that's being taught. Of course, that can have its disadvantages as well, especially if you and the professors having differing opinions on the topic examined. That's exactly what I found myself on a warm fall day in Lincoln, Nebraska, as I entered the classroom for Anthropology 101. I wasn't excited about the class in the first place. I just finished my degree at a nearby Bible college and was anxious to get into the field of education. The only reason I was here is because this class was a requirement for my teaching credentials. The very first session of the class, the author/professor made it very clear that evolution was fact and creation was just a story and would be handled as such. I'm hoping to this day no one noticed my face turning several shades of red. But hey, Jesus sat with publicans and sinners. I figured I could remain stealth-like and get through this with no one being the wiser. In reality, it was a fairly easy class. We'd read his chapter and answer his questions, and that was it. No major tests, no major papers, no field trips or archaeological digs. That all seemed well and good until the third session of class, when the professor mentioned that someone in the class had answered a question referring to the story of evolution. This apparently was very important and needed to be addressed before we could move on. In a concerned voice, he asked if anyone would mind openly debating creation versus evolution. Are you kidding me? Who would be stupid enough to go up against an alleged expert in the field of evolution, especially without notice? Apparently me. I'm not sure how my hand ended up above my head. Be aware, all through my high school and much of my college career, I'd managed to hide in the back of the room and just absorb the atmosphere and wisdom dedicated students shared. Yet there I was, ready to debate the professor. I don't remember a lot of the details of that discussion. I do remember hearing some of my answers and being rather surprised at the wisdom pouring out of these untrained lips. I also remember how class ended. The professor said, well, evolution has science to back up its claims. My response, true, but isn't creation also backed up by plenty of science? His response, yes, class dismissed, see you all next week. I leapt in a fog. It wasn't until later I realized that we'd come to a bit of a stalemate, which I considered a victory. Not so much because of my defense of my view on origins as the fact that I stood where no one else would stand and did so victoriously, so to speak. Sometimes our relationship with God will call us to make an open stand when we'd rather not, and when we do so in reliance on the Holy Spirit, God shows up. Such was the case with 3 young Hebrew men in the ancient nation of Babylon. They had been taken as exiles from Israel with the intent of being trained in Babylonian culture and religion so they could aid the kingdom in securing its culture and borders. They had a more famous friend that you may know better, named Daniel. You know, the Daniel who spent a night sleeping with the lions. At Daniel's request, his 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were given positions of power and prestige, much to the chagrin of others in the king's court who weren't real keen on the idea of being answerable to foreigners. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon at the time, was feeling pretty good about all his accomplishments, so he had an image of gold created to honor himself. This was no small statue on a pedestal. It rose 90 feet above the ground and was 9 feet thick. King Nebuchadnezzar made a gold statue 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Daniel 3:1. The king gave the command that whenever music was played, everyone was to bow down and worship the statue, aka Nebuchadnezzar. The word spread, the glorious statue was revealed, the music played, and everyone bowed to this magnificent statue in honor of a magnificent king. Well, almost everyone. 3 men stood tall among the worshippers. If you've ever seen a freshly plowed field with a lone tree standing in the middle of it, you may get the idea of the sight. 3 men standing tall among worshippers would be hard to hide, and such was the case of our 3 friends. Their refusal to obey orders quickly made its way to the throne, and the king was not happy. Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Daniel 3:13-15. To the king's credit, he gave the 3 men a second chance. In his original decree, he made no reference to second chances, but he was ready to do so for Shadrach and friends. Their friend Daniel had interpreted the king's dream. He praised the God of Daniel and of heaven for his wisdom and power. However, his worship was short-lived. Daniel's God may have been able to interpret dreams, but his power was limited in the king's eyes. He had a reputation to protect. His integrity and power were being challenged by 3 foreigners, and he wasn't about to let that happen. When he offered the 3 men a do-over, however, he was taken back by the response of the 3 Israelites. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into a blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up." That's from Daniel 3:16-18. 3 things the men told the king to note. Number 1, we aren't going to defend ourselves to you. Number 2, our God is bigger than your God and can easily deliver us. And number 3, if our God chooses not to deliver us, that's fine. We still aren't going to worship your God. Needless to say, Nebuchadnezzar didn't take this kindly. Nebuchadnezzar was so furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that his face became distorted with rage. He commanded that the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than usual. Then he ordered some of the strongest men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So they tied them up and threw them into the furnace, fully dressed in their pants, turbans, robes, and other garments. And because the king, in his anger, had demanded that the fire be so hot in the furnace, the flames killed the soldiers as they threw the 3 men in. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, securely tied, fell into the roaring flames. Daniel 3:19-23. Well, that didn't go well. The 3 men were tied up and thrown into a fire so hot it killed the men who threw them into the fire. The Bible doesn't tell us, but I wonder if the 3 men gave any resistance at all. Since they didn't defend themselves verbally, one wonders if they just jumped into the flames if the king would have asked. I read this story and visualize Jesus standing before the tribunal that would be responsible for his murder. Standing there silent to the accusations, realizing that in a word he could have totally had them destroyed. In the same way, these men from Israel weren't about to flinch at the threats of some puny human king. Once in the flames, the king watched the story unfold. It should have been a short story. 3 men die immediately, as did the soldiers. The flames engulfed them, nothing left but ashes. Mission accomplished. But that isn't what happened. Not even close. Suddenly, Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisors, "Didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them into the furnace?" "Yes, your majesty, we certainly did," they replied. "Look," Nebuchadnezzar shouted, "I see 4 men unbound walking around in the fire unharmed, and the fourth looks like a god." Daniel 3:24 and 25. There are plenty of theological theories as to who the fourth person was: Jesus, an angel, God the Father himself, etc. While those things are all pretty cool, let's not overlook the real miracle here. Even though they were in deadly flames, completely surrounded by a situation that meant immediate death, with no hope of survival, they were strolling through the fire. The fire burned off the ropes, but not the men. Kings normally don't bow down to anyone unless they're forced to, yet Nebuchadnezzar's short memory put him to his knees once again, just as he did when Daniel interpreted his dream earlier. He'd forgotten God's awesome power until he saw the 3 men meandering through the flames along with a godlike person. Again, we aren't given the details, but I imagine he was a bit shaken as he called the men out of the fire. Then Nebuchadnezzar came as close as he could to the door of the flaming furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stepped out of the fire. Then the high officers, officials, governors, and advisors crowded around them and saw that the fire had not touched them. Not a hair on their head was singed, and their clothing was not scorched. They didn't even smell like smoke. Daniel 3:26 and 27. Spoiler alert. While this chapter is about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we can also learn a lesson here from Nebuchadnezzar. One would think that after God showed his power to Nebuchadnezzar twice, it would make a lasting impression. But if you read ahead a few chapters in Daniel, you'll see that isn't true. God continued to deal with Nebuchadnezzar's pride, and don't think that once God shows his power, he'll never fall. We all do. He will always call us back into the fold. But back to our story. What we can learn from God showing up in the lives of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Well, the overriding lesson in this story is that taking a stand is often the best indicator of true faith. True faith is much more than a set of beliefs, opinions, and convictions. True faith requires action. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter." Daniel 3:16. First of all, we need to remember that true faith offers no alternatives. While I certainly would have chosen someone else to debate the professor at the beginning of this chapter, God had other ideas. I doubt very much that I did anything that day in class to change the professor's viewpoint on origins. No other classmates came up to me later and thanked me for a brilliant defense of the Bible. Sometimes those victories are internal, sometimes they are seeds that may germinate later in life. But I wasn't too impressed. I was simply called to stand and stand strong. Shadrach and friends weren't out to make a name for themselves or embarrass the king. They were simply called to do something quietly and stand by their convictions. The Apostle Paul states in his writings that his purpose was to bring the gospel to all people. He became a Greek to win the Greeks and a Hebrew to win the Jews, but his mission never conflicted with his convictions. There are times when we simply need to state graciously, "This is where I stand," and there can be no wavering. God gives the prophet Amos a vision of a plumb line. For those who may think this is a bunch of fruit placed side by side, let me explain. No, we have levels to determine the straightness of a wall or a pillar. A plumb line is a weighted string or a rope that when placed next to a wall will show if it's straight or plumb. Any deviance is not acceptable. What makes grace so amazing is that none of us, not a single one of us by our own power, live a life that is plumb with God's holiness. True faith is also based on character, not action. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us, Your Majesty. Daniel 3:17. Secondly, as followers of this sovereign, almighty God, we need to remember that true faith is based on character, not action. Genuine faith is more about an individual's inner disposition and values than just outward behaviors or rituals. Sincerity, integrity, and moral qualities are central to authentic faith. In our classroom example, I could have and would have preferred to sit quietly so as not to make waves and let the class go on. Frankly, it would not have made any difference in how I believed or lived. But true faith, true following of God, isn't about simply going through the motions of religious practices without genuine conviction or belief. Sometimes our belief system will call us to make graceful, quiet, yet obvious stands. In the midst of Job's suffering, he testifies to his faith by saying, "Even if he slay me, I will not fail to follow him." When Peter and John were threatened and ordered by religious leaders to stop talking about Jesus, they stated, "We cannot follow man's commands when they contradict what God has called us to do." Acts chapter 4. While we are called to live at peace with all men as much as possible, we need to be ready to take a stand. True faith also contradicts common sense. But even if he does not, we want you to know, Your Majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. Daniel 3:18. At times, true faith will contradict common sense. Shadrach and friends had no doubt seen the anger and rage Nebuchadnezzar instilled on people. Common sense for most of us would have been to kneel before the statue. Some may even kneel and say a quiet prayer that goes something like this: "I'm really kneeling before you, God. You know that. You know my heart. You know the consequences if I don't play the game, so forgive me." Others may have planned a boycott or some sort of protest against the whole idea. Remember, this huge statue didn't appear overnight. Shadrach and friends were in the inner circle and knew what was going on. There was plenty of time to protest, boycott, or speak evil against the king. I'm also guessing they followed the lead of Daniel and prayed regularly. They didn't go into this situation unaware. They went in prayed up, prepared, and patient. They had no idea of the outcome, but they knew their strategy, and that was to trust and hope. True faith also makes an impact. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego." He sent his angel to rescue his servants who trusted in him. They defied the king's command and were willing to die rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make this decree: if any people, whatever their race or nation or language, speak a word against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they will be torn limb from limb, and their houses will be turned into heaps of rubble. There is no other God who can rescue like this. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to even higher positions in the province of Babylon. Daniel 2:28-30. Lastly, faith makes an impact. The difficulty in this statement is that we may not see the impact we've made, if ever. Prosperity gospel teaches us that if we follow certain rules and dogmas, God will bless us beyond measure. Well, it would be great if that was true. We all know stories of people who have done all the right things and suffered loss, either physically, relationally, or financially. The story of Shadrach and friends ends nicely for them. They took a stand, endured the flames, and came out as heroes of the faith. The king rewarded them well, and they lived happily ever after. But let's be honest, life doesn't always work out that way. Sometimes we may have a stalemate, as I did in class that day. Other times we may walk away realizing we totally blew that opportunity. It's during those times when we need to realize that our standing isn't to win or impress others. Our standing isn't intended to change the world, or our standing is to give God the glory, and He alone is responsible for being the change agent. Many a grandparent has prayed fervently for a grandchild to find Christ and never seen the answer this side of heaven. Many of those prayers were answered at grandparents' funerals. Quoting from Paul again, "Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up." Proper time here is God's timing, not ours. Stand strong, stand true. Let God's power see you through. Remember, God shows up when we are willing to risk everything for our relationship with Him. Thanks for listening to this edition of God Shows Up. I hope it's been an encouragement to you in your walk with Jesus. Please leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, as this will increase our listenership. And reach out to me by email if you have any questions or prayer requests. Thanks again for listening, and have a blessed day.